Back in 1661, an ambitious French finance minister named Nicolas Fouquet hosted what was arguably the most spectacular and decadent celebration Europe had ever witnessed. Over 17,000 high society guests filled the estate, marveling at firework displays choreographed by the very masterminds who would later design the Palace of Versailles. The banquet was so blindingly opulent that the 22-year-old King Louis XIV sat in a prolonged, icy silence, hit by the immediate and humiliating realization that his own subordinate was living a far more luxurious life than the monarch himself. Less than a month later, Fouquet was abruptly cornered and arrested by the king's personal musketeers, ultimately spending the final 19 years of his existence locked away in a bleak fortress dungeon. Fast forward a century across the Atlantic, and Robert Morris, once widely recognized as the wealthiest individual in the American colonies, the financial genius who literally bankrolled the Revolutionary War out of his own pocket, passed away entirely broke in a forgotten boarding house, completely neglected by the young republic he bled to establish. These men were not foolish gamblers, nor were they intellectually deficient. They were brilliant, extraordinarily well-connected, and wielded immense institutional leverage. Their fatal error was that they failed to grasp a fundamental law of finance, the existence of three invisible, tectonic thresholds in the journey of building wealth. Crossing any one of these milestones shifts the structural rules of the game entirely. Because the vast majority of people remain completely blind to these boundaries, they spend their lifetimes trapped on an economic hamster wheel, perpetually frustrated by why standard math never seems to work in their favor. Let's sit with Fouquet's story a little longer, because the details matter more than most people realize. Fouquet wasn't reckless with money in the way we usually imagine recklessness. He wasn't drowning in gambling debts or throwing coins into the wind. He had built one of the most sophisticated financial networks in 17th century France. He understood credit, leverage, patronage, and political capital better than almost anyone alive at the time. And yet none of that saved him, because the one thing he never calculated was the invisible line between wealthy enough to be impressive and wealthy enough to be a threat. He crossed a line he didn't know existed, and the moment he crossed it, the rules of his entire existence silently changed underneath him without his knowledge. He kept playing the same game he'd always played, unaware that the board itself had shifted beneath his feet. Robert Morris is, in some ways, an even sadder case, because his failure wasn't political, it was purely structural. Morris understood exactly how to raise money, move money, and multiply money during wartime, when the entire system was screaming for liquidity and there was no shortage of desperate buyers for his financial instruments. But peacetime is a different animal entirely. Morris kept applying wartime financial logic to a peacetime economy, kept leveraging land speculation the same way he'd leveraged war bonds, and never recalibrated his internal model as the ground shifted underneath him. He died with more nominal paper wealth tied up in land than most families would see in 10 generations, and yet not $1 of it could put food on his table, because none of it existed at a threshold where it behaved the way he assumed it would behave. My name is Jordan, and I dedicate an unreasonable amount of my life to analyzing the deep psychology of money, compound mathematics, and the profound shifts that occur when you break through specific wealth checkpoints. If you are tired of working hard, saving diligently, and still feeling like you are fundamentally spinning your wheels, I want you to stay with me for this entire breakdown, because by the end of it, you are going to look at your own bank account completely differently. I am going to expose exactly why the mainstream financial advisory complex has absolutely zero incentive to teach you about these milestones, why your corporate employer actively profits from your ongoing ignorance, and how internalizing these three specific targets will completely reshape the way you evaluate every single dollar that enters your bank account from this moment onward. But to truly understand this layout, we have to travel back 6 centuries to Renaissance Italy. The events that unfolded in the streets of Florence 600 years ago perfectly explain why you are likely feeling stagnant right now and why the generic economic advice handed down to you has been subtly, deliberately flawed from day one. Let's look at the Medici Bank in the year 1434. At the time, Florence was a relatively compact city of roughly 60,000 citizens, essentially the geographic footprint of a modern-day Bozeman, Montana, or Flagstaff, Arizona. It was by no means a global metropolis, yet this small cluster of merchants was generating far more raw capital than empires 10 times its size. The Medicis did not inherit vast empires. They began as regular wool merchants, firmly anchored in the middle class of their era. Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici had quietly established a very basic, unexceptional banking storefront. There was nothing about their early operation that suggested his lineage would eventually dictate the papacy, marry into European royalty, or control the geopolitical destiny of Western civilization. However, his visionary son, Cosimo de' Medici, spotted a structural anomaly that changed everything. I need you to pay absolute, undivided attention to this specific realization, because this single insight carries more raw financial value than any speculative stock tip you will ever receive. Cosimo discovered that there was a distinct, quantifiable threshold of capital allocation beyond which money entirely ceased to behave by normal human rules. Below this specific line, money was purely defensive. You had to protect it, hoard it, and view every single expense through a lens of fear and survival. Every individual florin carried massive weight, and an unexpected emergency was viewed as a potential catastrophe. You were forced to think short-term, focusing entirely on surviving the next quarter or the next harvest. But Cosimo observed that the moment you crossed this invisible financial boundary, a truly bizarre phenomenon occurred. You earned the luxury of making mistakes without facing total economic destruction. You could actively take bold, calculated risks that would instantly wipe out a smaller merchant, but would merely register as a minor, temporary dent on a larger balance sheet. More importantly, you gained the immense power to say an unyielding no to bad opportunities, simply because you had zero immediate need for the cash flow. Consider the structural contrast. The smaller, vulnerable bankers of Florence were forced to accept whatever desperate business walked through their front doors. They lacked the luxury of selectivity. If a highly risky loan came along, they had to underwrite it anyway, because they were starved for the immediate interest payments just to cover their fixed overhead. They were permanently enslaved by their own systemic fragility. Cosimo, however, possessed the ultimate leverage: time. He could easily let the high-risk, desperate deals fall to his frantic competitors while he patiently waited for the pristine, high-probability plays. He could exclusively wait for the elite merchants whose cargo fleets were heavily insured, the noblemen whose vast estates were completely unencumbered by prior debt, or the strategic ventures where the mathematical upside was infinite and the downside was tightly capped. Think about what that actually means in practice for a moment. Two merchants walk into Cosimo's counting house on the same afternoon. One is desperate, offering a slightly higher interest rate because he needs the capital by sundown to save a failing shipment. The other is patient, offering a lower rate but backed by 3 separate insured vessels and a proven decade of reliable trade. A banker below the threshold takes the desperate merchant every single time because he needs the yield to survive his own week. Cosimo takes the patient merchant every single time because he doesn't need anything from anyone. Over the span of a decade, that single behavioral difference compounds into an almost incomprehensible gap in outcomes, not because Cosimo was smarter about picking deals, but because he had the structural freedom to only pick the good ones. Through meticulous observation, Cosimo calculated that once an entity possessed enough liquid capital to survive 3 consecutive years of absolute, unmitigated business failure, they had officially migrated into an entirely different echelon of wealth. The critical takeaway here, and the concept that fundamentally shifted my entire worldview on asset accumulation, is that this wealth advantage is completely nonlinear. It does not scale in a smooth, predictable line. There was a hard, definitive breaking point where the physics of money inverted. Below that line, you were playing a high-friction game with an entirely different rulebook. It is the functional difference between checkers and chess. Same physical board, but a completely decoupled strategic dimension. Cosimo explicitly outlined 3 separate thresholds in detailed letters to his family, documents that economic historians have studied for centuries. The very first boundary was what he coined the breathing line, the precise milestone where you accumulate enough liquidity to absorb sudden economic shocks without falling into a state of panic. The second was the multiplication line, where your capital base works with such aggressive velocity that its organic growth outpaces your physical capability to spend it on basic human necessities. The third and final stage was the immortality line, the transcendent zone where your accumulated wealth outlives your biological clock, automatically expanding across generations, regardless of individual family errors. The Medicis successfully breached all 3 stages. By 1513, their lineage had produced multiple popes, engineered queens of France, and dictated more raw liquidity than the majority of European sovereign nations combined. They had completely bypassed the typical, high-friction relationship between human beings and money. The real tragedy, however, lies in what happened to their peers. The rival merchant families who started with identical amounts of capital in 1434, who were initially the absolute equals and direct competitors of the Medicis, almost completely vanished from the history books within 2 generations. They did not collapse because of a singular, catastrophic war, nor were they suddenly robbed or conquered. They quietly faded into obscurity because they completely failed to recognize these 3-phase transitions. They consistently made aggressive Stage 1 decisions while possessing Stage 2 capital, or they arrogantly behaved as if they were protected by Stage 3 immortality when they were barely clinging to the fragile edges of Stage 2. Because they failed to recalibrate their psychological models as their actual financial reality shifted, the math ruthlessly corrected them into bankruptcy. There's a specific family worth mentioning here, though history has mostly erased their name from popular memory. The Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses, contemporaries of the early Medici, who at one point were considerably larger and more powerful than Giovanni de' Bicci's modest operation. The Bardi and Peruzzi families made a catastrophic error that illustrates this entire framework perfectly. They extended enormous, concentrated loans to King Edward III of England to fund his wars, operating as though their scale made them immune to a single counterparty's default. When Edward defaulted on his debts, both banking houses collapsed within years of each other, wiping out fortunes that had taken generations to build. They had the capital of Stage 2, perhaps even brushing against Stage 3, But they made a stage one decision, putting an existential percentage of their total capital behind a single, undiversified bet because they had never internalized which stage they were actually operating in. Size without structural awareness is not safety. It is simply a bigger, more expensive way to be wrong. This historical reality matters to you today because these exact three thresholds govern modern economics under identical principles. The absolute dollar amounts have changed due to inflation, but the core mathematics and behavioral psychology remain completely unchanged. And just like in Renaissance Florence, the surrounding system goes to great lengths to ensure you never discover them. Your traditional financial planner will never map these out for you because they cannot easily package them into a high-fee product pitch. The banking system actively ignores them because these milestones represent the exact moments you cease to depend on their debt products. The mainstream financial media deliberately muddies the waters because their entire revenue model requires you to remain constantly anxious, perpetually confused, and endlessly clicking on articles about the next speculative stock option. Today, we are breaking down the wall and looking at the actual, raw numbers required to conquer today's economy. Once you see this map clearly, your relationship with money will be permanently transformed. Let us dive directly into the first major milestone. I want to be hyper-specific here, because vague financial platitudes are completely useless. Telling an individual to simply save more money is as hollow as telling someone to be healthier. It is technically accurate but practically worthless. So here is the exact modern number. The first critical net worth milestone is $100,000 in pure investable assets. Do not misinterpret this. I am not talking about $100,000 in total net worth. I am not including the estimated equity in your primary home, the depreciating value of the vehicle sitting in your driveway, or your household furniture. We are talking about $100,000 in cold, liquid capital, actively deployed and compounding inside the market. Money that functions as a tireless employee while you sleep. Here is the raw psychological reality that the institutional investment complex will never admit to you because it completely shatters their marketing narratives. Below the $100,000 threshold, the concept of compound interest is practically an illusion. Every mainstream financial guru and digital retirement calculator loves to display those flawless, smooth exponential curves, making it seem as though tucking away pocket change will effortlessly balloon into a multi-million-dollar fortune over time. Mathematically, yes, the underlying equation operates identically at any scale. The compound formula does not discriminate between $1,000 and $1 million. However, from a practical, psychological, and behavioral standpoint, compound interest does not feel like it is working at all until you cross this specific six-figure marker. Because the immediate feedback loop feels completely stagnant in the early stages, the vast majority of savers lose heart and abandon the process entirely before the momentum ever truly triggers. Let us look directly at the actual math so you can internalize this reality. If you have managed to save $10,000 and have it fully invested, pulling in a solid 8% annual return, which aligns with the long-term historical average of the broader stock market, you will generate roughly $800 over the course of an entire year. That breaks down to a mere $66 a month. While that is technically positive, it is completely unnoticeable in the grand scheme of your daily life. It does not alter your lifestyle. It does not cover your basic utility bills. And when you log into your investment dashboard at the end of the quarter, the balance looks effectively identical to where it started. The number technically ticked upward, but your perceived wealth did not shift, meaning your behavioral choices remain unchanged. The compounding mechanism is running, but it is completely invisible. Scale that up to a $50,000 portfolio under the exact same 8% return metrics, and you are looking at $4,000 a year, or roughly $333 a month. It is an improvement, certainly, but it still lacks the structural power to change your life. A single volatile week in the market can instantly wipe out months of hard-fought gains on paper, leaving you feeling exposed, anxious, and deeply exposed to macro disruptions. The magic entirely shifts the moment you cross the $100,000 line. At this specific marker, that exact same 8% average return translates into a clean $8,000 a year, pumping a consistent $666 every single month into your asset base. Suddenly, the math becomes visually undeniable. When you log into your accounts, you are no longer looking at minor statistical noise. You are looking at a meaningful influx of capital. Even if the market experiences a temporary correction and drops your balance by $5,000, the psychological blow is softened because you know the organic engine is strong enough to recover rapidly. A green month can easily flash an additional $7,000 or $8,000 onto your balance sheet. This is the exact inflection point where your money begins to manifest its own distinct personality and autonomous momentum. It is no longer a passive pool of stagnant cash. It is transformed into an active, self-sustaining compounding machine. The real transformation here is fundamentally psychological, completely overriding the mere mathematical milestones. The moment your passive investment gains scale to represent a significant percentage of your active career salary, your entire systemic relationship with employment undergoes a radical evolution. Think about what this means on an operational level. Let us assume you earn a standard salary of $70,000 a year from your primary job. When your liquid portfolio starts throwing off $8,000 annually, it means your accumulated capital is now independently generating over 11% of your total human labor income. You no longer evaluate your employment through a lens of absolute, desperate survival. You begin to view it as a calculated, deliberate choice. You are obviously not ready to quit your day job just yet, but the invisible golden handcuffs holding you down suddenly feel significantly looser. That subtle evaporation of career desperation fundamentally alters how you negotiate, how you price your time, and how you evaluate macro opportunities. You suddenly possess the quiet confidence to demand the salary increase you have been putting off for years. You find the courage to walk away from a toxic team dynamic, or you strategically pivot to a new corporate role that offers identical pay, but massive long-term upside. You are simply no longer acting from a baseline of acute fear. Now, it is completely natural to look at a six-figure milestone and think, that sounds incredible in theory, but $100,000 feels like an insurmountable mountain for someone earning an average wage. This is precisely the point where most people get overwhelmed and quit. The absolute truth that no one wants to say out loud is that the journey from zero to your first $100,000 is a brutal, agonizing slog. It is structurally the hardest, highest friction phase of the entire wealth-building journey. The financial services industry completely glosses over this because they need you to believe that wealth accumulation is an effortless, friction-free process achieved by clicking a few buttons on a mobile app. Digital influencers mask this reality because slow, boring consistency does not generate viral engagement. Let us be entirely realistic. Scaling an account from absolute scratch to $100,000 on an average income typically demands 7 to 10 years of unyielding, highly disciplined saving and investing. It is slow, it is deeply unglamorous, and it is the absolute antithesis of the instant gratification narratives plastered across social media feeds. During this initial phase, you are contributing your hard-earned cash month after month, and the organic market growth feels completely pathetic compared to your manual deposits. Imagine you are aggressively investing $500 a month, a figure that represents a genuine lifestyle sacrifice for the average household. That amounts to $6,000 a year, extracted directly from your physical labor. Under a standard 8% market return, your portfolio might generate a tiny $200 or $300 on its own during those early months. Your manual labor is doing 95% of the heavy lifting. It feels entirely pointless. You are sacrificing real lifestyle comfort, putting in $6,000 and looking at a balance of $6,300. This exact structural bottleneck is where 90% of individuals throw in the towel. They run the immediate projections, conclude that the growth is too negligible to justify the daily deprivation, and choose to divert their cash back into lifestyle consumption. They lease the premium vehicle, book the expensive vacation, and soothe their financial conscience by telling themselves they will start saving seriously later in life when their income expands. Let me walk you through exactly what that abandonment looks like in real numbers, because I think seeing it laid out year by year makes the mistake far more visceral than just describing it in the abstract. Imagine two people, both starting at age 25, both earning identical salaries, both with identical living expenses. One of them commits to that same $500 monthly contribution and simply refuses to stop, regardless of how pointless the early years feel. The other person starts strong for 18 months, watches the balance sit stubbornly around $9,000, gets frustrated, and quietly redirects that money toward a nicer apartment and a better car. 10 years later, the person who quit has nothing to show for those 18 months except some depreciated furniture and a car that's now worth half of what they paid. The person who stayed the course has crossed $100,000 and is now watching that money generate more in a single year than their entire initial 18 months of contributions combined. The gap between these two people isn't talent, it isn't income. It is entirely the willingness to tolerate an extended period of feeling like nothing is happening. But here is the core mathematical secret you must deeply internalize. Moving your asset base from $100,000 to $200,000 takes roughly half the time as the initial climb from $0 to $100,000. This acceleration does not occur because you suddenly doubled your savings rate, nor does it require a massive career promotion. It happens because your capital base is now contributing heavy leverage to its own expansion. At an 8% return rate, your $100,000 foundation is automatically stacking $8,000 a year completely passively while you sleep. When you combine that organic growth with your ongoing manual $6,000 annual contributions, your engine is now expanding by $14,000 a year, nearly 2.5 times the velocity of your initial start. The financial snowball has finally built enough mass to roll under its own gravity, and the jump from $200,000 to $400,000 triggers even faster. The acceleration curve becomes almost mathematically unfair past a certain checkpoint. This is why the first threshold changes everything. It marks your definitive transition from an endless uphill battle into an autonomous system. To make this concept completely concrete, let us use a physical analogy. Imagine you are tasked with filling a massive, Olympic-sized swimming pool using nothing but a standard backyard garden hose. For the first several hours of running the water, you are not creating a pool at all. You are simply creating a shallow, uninspiring puddle across the concrete floor. You check on your progress after an hour of focused effort, and there is barely half an inch of water scattered across the bottom. It does not look like a luxury asset. It looks like a plumbing leak. To make matters worse, the heat of the sun is constantly evaporating a portion of the water you just put in. You are standing there completely exhausted, wondering if this grand plan is an absolute exercise in futility. That is the exact reality of the $0 to $100,000 phase. It is the puddle phase. However, the exact moment the water level climbs a few feet up the sturdy concrete walls of the pool, the entire structural dynamic alters. Now, every single gallon you add causes the water line to rise visibly against the marker. Your garden hose has not changed. The water pressure is identical, but the compounding geometry is completely different because the water has nowhere left to scatter. You completely stop thinking about quitting because the visible feedback loops prove the system is working. The individuals who successfully engineer massive net worths are not inherently smarter, nor do they possess secret investment algorithms. They are simply the rare subset of humans who possess the psychological grit to survive the puddle phase. They keep the hose running when the immediate feedback looks completely hopeless. This brings us directly to the second major milestone, where the underlying rules of the game take a highly counterintuitive turn. The second major net worth checkpoint that fundamentally alters your existence is accumulating $500,000 in pure investable assets. This is the definitive boundary that separates the merely comfortable middle class from the truly insulated elite. Here is the operational reason why this specific $500,000 marker carries such immense weight. Under a highly conservative 4% safe withdrawal rate, the baseline standard for long-term wealth preservation, a $500,000 portfolio, can reliably generate $20,000 of pure passive income every single year, completely indefinitely, without ever depleting the principal capital. While $20,000 a year is obviously not going to fund a high-flying luxury lifestyle in a major metropolis, it represents something far more valuable. It completely covers the absolute baseline floor of physical human survival almost anywhere in the world. It secures your housing in affordable markets, handles your caloric needs, pays your basic utilities, and covers baseline transportation. But the true leverage of this milestone is not the capital you can physically extract from the accounts. It is the absolute evaporation of systemic economic fear from your psychology. When you have $500,000 actively compounding in diversified markets, you become functionally immune to the threat of sudden corporate unemployment. Think deeply about the profound reality of that position. You could walk into your workplace tomorrow, get abruptly downsized, fired, or watch your entire industry segment get disrupted by artificial intelligence. And while it would certainly represent a structural inconvenience, it would completely fail to register as a life catastrophe. You will not lose your home. You will not face food insecurity. And you are under zero pressure to accept the first terrible, low-ball job offer that comes along just to keep the lights on. You can easily afford to take 6 months, or even a full calendar year, to rest, retrain, and negotiate your next major career move from a position of total structural sovereignty. This asset-backed psychological leverage is worth vastly more than the raw $500,000 itself. You unlock what I call total walk-away power, the absolute ability to exit toxic, exploitative environments without facing a single negative consequence to your standard of living. Think about the millions of highly stressed workers who remain trapped in soul-crushing corporate jobs, enduring psychological abuse from micromanaging executives. They stay exclusively because they are forced to, anchored by the terrifying reality that they are precisely 1 or 2 missed paychecks away from absolute financial ruin. Your employer understands this dynamic perfectly, which is exactly why they can comfortably deny your promotion, cap your wage growth below the rate of inflation, and demand unpaid weekend labor. But the moment you hold $500,000 in liquid capital, the balance of power permanently flips. You become an asset operating with unlimited options, allowing you to establish firm boundaries, speak with total candor in executive meetings, and aggressively optimize your life, because getting fired has completely lost its sting. This shift isn't loud, it's structural. You don't suddenly feel richer, you feel steadier. And that steadiness is worth more than any dopamine hit from a big purchase. But this middle stretch, from $100,000 to $500,000, comes with its own trap. As your balance grows, it starts attracting attention, riskier pitches, you've earned it purchases, friends with sudden investment ideas. This is exactly where Cosimo's rivals failed. They had stage 2 money, but kept making stage 1 decisions, chasing risk out of habit rather than need. The danger here isn't running out of money. It's forgetting you no longer have to take the risks you took when you had nothing. Beyond $500,000 lies a third threshold, what Cosimo called the immortality line. Unlike the first two, it isn't a dollar figure. It's the difference between wealth that survives you and wealth that quietly disappears. History backs this up starkly. Most affluent families lose their fortune by the second generation, almost all by the third. Not because the money vanishes, but because the family never builds the structures that make wealth outlast any one person's decisions. It's why lottery winners so often end up broke, sudden money without the psychology to hold it. So here's the full map: years of invisible effort until $100,000, acceleration and rising confidence toward $500,000, and beyond that, a shift from surviving to building something that lasts. The lines were always there. The only real question is which one you're standing on right now. And what you do next